Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about part 2 of Drinking the Sea at Gaza, Nights and Days, Days and Nights in a Land Under Siege by Amira. So part 1 was trying to look at the conditions of the occupation. Today, part 2, I'm going to be talking about intra-Palestinian struggles. How did the Palestinians live among each other in the occupation? And I think Amira, living with Gazans for so many years, was able to give us some good insights that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get. So we'll start with the idea of a Hamula and a super Hamula. So a Hamula is a clan. This could be composed of your family or larger extended family, or even in a sense your village. But the super Hamulas would include your factions. And here Amira breaks this down. Whatever the political orientation of a super Hamula, 3 elements were essential to its public legitimacy in the years before the Oslo agreements. First, there was the ideological aspect, that is, how the organization gave expression to people's national longings and gave impetus to the struggle to satisfy them. Then, there was the aspect of support, both material and emotional. The organization's ability to care for people in the community in the difficult conditions of occupation and scarcity. Lastly, the base of the triangle, if the other 2 elements constituted its 2 sides, was the constituency, the followers who identified with the organization's position or simply felt at home in it and gave it strength and cohesion. The relative importance of each of these 3 elements was never fixed, but even today, under Palestinian self-rule, they continue to constitute a triangle of legitimacy. So all of those aspects have to be part of how Gazans would support any particular faction. Ideology, support, and the constituency. Who are the people who are actually with you? In November 1994, Gaza woke up to a nightmare. The delicate balance between the 2 rival forces was upset, setting in motion a chain of events that verged on an all-out civil war. The cycle would recur again and again over the next few years, each time bringing Gaza to the brink of bloodshed. First, a central figure in one of the Islamic organizations would be assassinated, and everyone, including Israeli observers, would hold Israel responsible. Second, a Palestinian Muslim cell would attack Israelis in retaliation. Third, the Palestinian Authority would respond by initiating forceful measures, including mass arrests of opposition supporters and anyone suspected of planning attacks. Israel, meanwhile, would impose a rigid closure, sealing off the Strip and the West Bank, add ever harsher restrictions, and bring suffering upon the entire Palestinian population. Finally, the Authority would silence all critics, harassing journalists, clamping down on the press, holding people in jail for extended periods of time after subjecting them to torture and humiliation. The end of the cycle would be signaled when the Authority released some of its prisoners and Israel began to ease the closure. Each time the cycle recurred, the rift in Palestinian society grew wider, even as Israeli and American leaders rushed to praise Arafat's actions as decisive steps in the fight against terror. Palestinians felt only alienation from their leaders. So, in what she's describing there, you have to realize not all Palestinians agreed on how to move forward, whether for religious reasons, whether for political reasons. Remember that the PLO leadership had been away in Tunisia for many years. Them coming back and then Arafat coming to Gaza was not welcomed in the same way by everybody. They didn't necessarily see Arafat as an outright enemy, but clearly as a collaborator with the Israelis, and in some senses, the Israelis' lapdog. And so you have different factions acting in different ways. The Israelis put pressure on the PA to make mass arrests. Arafat does this in order to save face, but it doesn't necessarily do anything. And as she ends here, Palestinians felt only alienation from their leaders, even as Arafat would get praise from the Israelis. Almost like a good dog, pat on the head. So nice to see you do all those mass arrests. Don't know if that was necessarily helpful, Something else that was really interesting to me was finding out that there is discrimination against Palestinian refugees by native Gazans. So when I say native Gazans, I mean the people who did not flee anywhere in 1948. They happened to live in Gaza. They'd lived there for generations. So they didn't go anywhere. They stayed in place. And they're known as the Muwahatin. I want to make sure I'm saying that right. Muwatanin. So these are the people who are native Gazans, you could say the nobility, the upper classes of Gaza. And here are a couple stories that give you some insight into this and then some statistics. Abu Majid's home is in Gaza City's Nasser neighborhood, where refugees and Muwatanin live side by side. 4 years ago, his daughter reached school age and was about to start at the UNRWA school for refugees. We'll be able to walk to school together, she told a friend happily. The friend, the daughter of Muwatanin, replied haughtily, No, we won't. You're a Mahajera, a refugee. You have to go to school in the camp. That was the first time she'd heard the word, Abu Majid said, and she came to ask me what it meant. She thought the girl was cursing at her. I told her that it's an honor to be called a refugee. It means that we left, and we have land in Beersheba, and her grandfather and parents used to live there. I'd always hoped that I wouldn't have to tell her, and now she keeps asking me when I'll take her to Beersheba. Sometimes we feel like gypsies in Europe, like people without respect. If one of us wants to marry a Gazan girl, the first thing they say is that he's a refugee. That hurts. And we heard about this in Gaza Writes Back. If you haven't seen that, review, I'll put a card to that, in which one of the young Gazan writers was writing about this separation, this idea that, I'm a refugee, I can't marry this Gazan girl. We actually saw that in a story. Some of the young Muwatanin bristled defensively when I asked them about the refugees' feelings. I heard facile nationalistic slogans, especially from landowners and children of the well-off old families. We're all Palestinians. We all feel the same, they said. We didn't cause their loss. We're not responsible. But in the same breath, they admitted to never having set foot in any corner of al-Shati camp, only 10 minutes walk from their comfortable homes in the shade of the Ponciana trees. So even among their own, they're otherized, they're refugees, which is sad to think. So when we tried, those of us who are outsiders, when we think of the Palestinians as a bloc, we shouldn't, insofar as they are oppressed, but they're not all oppressed equally, and they don't all get along with each other in the same way, and that's okay. That's neither right nor wrong. That just makes them human. But what Haas's book does so well is help put a human face on the Palestinians so that we can understand them more, we can see what they're going through more, and also to remind us that they're not alien beings, that they, like us, have jealousies, love, hope, anger, etc. Gaza's marriage statistics confirm the society's segregation of the refugees. The percentage of mixed marriages between refugees and old Gazans is minuscule. In 1995, there were 8,788 marriages according to the records. Of those, 45% represented Muwatanin couples and 45% refugee couples. Only 5% were marriages between refugee men and Muwatanin women, and 4% between refugee women and male Muwatanin. And that year actually showed an increase in intermarriage over previous years. In 1992, for example, there were 7,280 marriages and only 6.1% of those were mixed. So understand that even between each other, the Palestinians in Gaza are not a bloc. One of the things we've been doing all throughout the series of videos that I've been doing since October is hearing stories of the Nakba, those of us who were not there, who don't have any relatives who could tell us these stories. These are the first times that many of us are hearing these stories, and I don't think we can hear them enough because it's a way to understand what was lost. And so these will be peppered throughout, and this is just another one of these stories. But they all have the similar sense of longing and loss, and more importantly, I would say most importantly, is remembrance. It was morning, Iyam's mother began. My mother woke me up because of the shooting. We had a big house made of clay, and the goats in the yard began to run around like crazy, back and forth. My father was out working in the citrus groves, and we children stayed inside with my mother. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know what was happening outside. We just heard a lot of noise. We didn't know whether other people were running away. Suddenly, my father came back, breathless. He said something to my mother and let the goats out the yard. My mother lifted us little girls under her arms and followed father outside. We all started walking with the goats toward Beit Tima, probably because there were men there from the Palestinian militia who were trying to defend the village. We left all our things in the house, our clothes, pots and pans, and all the wheat. Once we were settled in Bet Tema, my mother and oldest sister went back to Burair at night to get the sacks of wheat. During the day, my father and the boys went out to pasture with the goats, and my mother and we girls would sit and grind the wheat with a mortar and pestle. After 2 months or maybe less, the Jews came to Bet Tema and attacked us over and over again. Some people died, and whoever was left fled to Majdal, where the Egyptians were. There were so many Egyptian soldiers in Majdal, Iyam's father joined in. They could have reached Tel Aviv without firing a single shot had they wanted to. If you'd like to learn more about the Egyptian advance, I'll put a card to the war on Palestine, and you can learn more about what the Egyptians did or didn't do. We were in Majdal for about 5 months, Iyam's mother continued. People kept going back to Burair. I just want to make sure I'm pronouncing that Burayr, Burair. Some of them had hidden gold and went to get it, but we were hungry more often than not, and that's how it was until they attacked Majdal. Iyam's father told about the attacks, which began in October 1948. They went after civilian places so that people would flee. After a week, the Egyptians retreated along the coastal road in their vehicles, and we followed them on foot, each family with its children and old people in the direction of Gaza. Some of the people from Burair had gone straight to Gaza even when the Egyptians were holding Majdal. In Majdal, we lived next to a citrus orchard, Iyam's mother said. Once a shell landed there and the shrapnel hit the house. A pregnant woman was killed on the spot. I saw her die with my own eyes. I couldn't stop crying. All our clothes were burned. My father was praying in the mosque, and my mother took me over there and yelled at him. What are you doing? She said. You're praying while the house burns down. We left that same day. We had nothing. Some of the goats had already died from hunger. We took the ones that were left. Iyam's Uncle Fauzi added his own memory. Our parents always talked about one aunt whose husband wouldn't leave Burair. She decided to go back and look for him, but someone from Majdal told her that he'd been killed. She went anyway, taking a big hoe and her younger brother, and they walked all the way back to Burair. They found her dead husband and dragged him in a sack to the village cemetery where she buried him. The Jews saw them and began to shoot. When her father heard what had happened, he swore at her. Your husband wasn't the only one who was killed, he said, and you took my only son with you. Why? So that he would be killed too? Iyam's mother told how, once in Gaza, she and her family first went to the Khan Yunis camp. Then, when there was a ceasefire in February 1949, they moved to Jabalia, to the Jorn, an open space where the villagers brought their wheat for threshing. It is now covered with refugee shacks. We were the first family there, and they gave us a tent. Some of our goats died, and we sold the rest. After that, each family began to look for relatives so that they could all move into the same tents. The small tents, about 2 yards by 2 yards, were called parachutes, Iyam's father said. They were for the small families. Bigger families were given a jaras, about 4 by 4. The largest families lived together in a tent called a kuk, 3.5 by 7 for 3 families. It made no difference whether they were related or not. We got 2 tents, Iyam's mother said, until we could start to build. The UN gave us flour. We children didn't understand what was happening, but we heard the adults saying, tomorrow, inshallah, God willing, we'll go back to our village. Inshallah, we'll go home. And ever since, their lives have been one long wait for something that gets farther and farther away. Bassam, a son, interjected. So, if you were not born in these villages and you're told these stories by your family members, it it turns out that you internalize these stories so much that you then say that you are from this village, even though you were born in Gaza. And I found this to be remarkable. So people got into a little bit of a fender bender, or I think not quite a fender bender, but the cars were blocked in, and people were complaining, where'd you learn how to drive? I was ready for a lively shouting match, but instead saw the driver and his 3 passengers grinning from ear to ear. Where are you from? He asked Abu Ali, as if to say, where were you born that you drive like such a jackass? From Simsim, Abu Ali responded, referring to the village where Kibbutz Gavarim now stands. I was confused, since I knew Abu Ali was from a village called Burayir, where Kibbutz Bror Hayil is today. That is, his family was from Burayir. He himself was born in the Jabalia refugee camp, but had assimilated all his parents' memories, down to the colors of the wheat and corn, the sight of the plums and oranges and grapes, the smell of the fertile earth. My confusion reminded Abu Ali that I wasn't a native of the camp, where every one of the 80,000 residents knew everyone else, and he explained, that's Ashraf, and he's from Simsim. That is, his parents are from Simsim, the next village over from ours. And I was laughing at him just as people from Burayir always laugh at people from Simsim and vice versa. He was trying to say that I drive like an idiot because I'm from Burayir, and I basically told him that only a jackass from Simsim would drive like that. But Abu Ali was saying something else too. He was saying we Gazans continue to hold on to our allegiances to villages we no longer possess. Each of us to his own village and to our neighbors in the next village a good mile or 2 down the road, even if we've been living huddled together in this sea of gray buildings and sandy alleys for 50 years now, forced to stretch our necks for a little bit of open space, for a glimpse of sky. Wow, what a passage. I once overheard a conversation between a commander in the new Palestinian security force and a civilian clerk who recorded goods entering and leaving the strip. Where are you from? The officer asked the clerk. From Dimra, he replied, even though he actually lived in the Jabalia refugee camp. And you? The clerk asked the officer. Al-Batani, he answered, even though he lived in the Al-Burej camp. Both the men were born in the Gaza Strip and knew of the villages only from their parents and grandparents. But in mentioning the names, the two took their place in an essential human chain that challenges history and defies the passage of time with an individual and a collective inner truth that refuses to die. I mean, just beautiful. Now, I'm just going to read briefly about some corruption here. This is something that I heard from Palestinians when I visited Nazareth and when I visited Bethlehem. They gave me examples of corrupt jobs that were held by the Palestinian Authority, and it cannot be underestimated that the election in 2006 that brought Hamas to power was powered in part by frustration with the corruption in the PA. After the Palestinian Authority was installed, its elite immediately set up a series of extensive monopolistic arrangements with several Israeli firms. The first 2 agreements were concluded with Nesher, which has the exclusive right to supply black cement to all Authority territory, and Dor Energy, which has the monopoly on gasoline, diesel fuel, and cooking and heating gas. These transactions not only shut out Israeli competitors and violated the free market principles to which the Authority had committed itself, but also eliminated hundreds of Palestinian retailers, importers, and truck drivers who had sold these products directly in the occupied territories. Consumers were also affected because prices rose even though the Authority was buying the supplies at a discount. Frozen meat, flour, paint, and wood are also sold in Authority territory through similar monopolistic arrangements with Israeli firms, and the right to market these goods has been awarded to just a handful of Palestinian agents. All these gigantic transactions have been brokered by Al-Bahar, a Palestinian parent company set up right after the Authority's establishment, which operates in a gray area, part private concern, part government company. According to various credible reports, Al-Bahar's anonymous owners are senior officials in the Palestinian executive and security branches who have a hand in all aspects of the political negotiations. Therefore, carry VIP permits, exempting them from the restrictions related to the closures that hobble other businesses. And for those who are not familiar, all of this is happening after Oslo and the First Intifada. And there are books that I'm going to review that will give us more details about both Oslo and about the First Intifada. But what you have to understand is, I mean, what a colossal failure Oslo was in so many ways. And people like me who didn't really know the situation and just bought into, oh, a two-state solution. Yes, I support that. I said that for so many years, like an idiot, and not realizing what Oslo had done was to put the Palestinians in this ridiculous straitjacket and still not promise them a state with any sort of reasonable timeline. And this short passage by Amira Haas gives us a sense of what Oslo was supposed to do, the idea of it. As for Israel, the Oslo agreements gave it the power to enhance or diminish the authorities' legitimacy in the eyes of the Palestinians because Israel's actions would determine the authorities' success. Following the agreement, people expected to change its policies, to end the closure system, which had kept Palestinians in near-siege circumstances on and off since 1991, to release all Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, whom the Palestinians think of as POWs, to restore freedom of movement between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, to allow access to Jerusalem, the Palestinians' economic, cultural, and religious center, to remove the remaining restrictions on economic activity, and to ensure free movement of workers and goods to and from Israel. The bargain struck between Fatah, the authority, and the Palestinian people became directly contingent on these changes. But not all of Gaza was party to this bargain. The leaders of the largest opposition bloc, the Islamic movement, represented by Hamas, were appalled by the accords, believing that they traded sacred Palestinian rights for paltry material gains. Our people are simple, a senior Hamas member told me shortly before the redeployment, dismissing even those economic and general improvements that might actually be realized. If someone's son gets out of prison early, or someone else goes back to work or can open his store in the evenings, they'll support the agreements for a while. But later, when they discover that it's not the way to get back our national rights, they'll rise up a second time. And, of course, he was right. Unfortunately, if you have this agreement with the Israelis, and the Israelis are putting pressure on you in the name of quote-unquote security, unbelievably to me, you're going to start imitating Israel's methods, which I couldn't believe, but that's what ended up happening, including torture, including imprisonment without trial, without charges, including secret trials at night. The Palestinian Authority did all these things, and I'm about to share them with you, which Amira had the chance to witness herself. Arafat promised Rabin vigorous efforts to combat terror, and the very next day, the newly formed Palestinian State Security Court held its first session. The court became synonymous with speedy secret trials held at night before military judges, with little or no legal training. Lawyers for the defendants had no advance knowledge of their clients' cases and no time to prepare their defense. The families of the defendants, meanwhile, were not kept informed of proceedings, and the accused themselves never knew where they were being taken when they were hustled out of their homes without warning in the dead of night. A friend of mine, a Fatah member, told me, "My friends from security were there at the trials. They said they'd never seen anything so horrible in their whole lives." Keep in mind, a lot of these people were in prison by the Israelis, and they're saying they hadn't seen anything so horrible. We have to maintain a certain number of prisoners to satisfy the Israelis, a report by the Palestinian Society for the Protection of Human Rights and the Environment quoted a prison guard as saying. Of course, there are those that the authority wants in jail, but most of these guys are here to fill a quota. This is about a midnight raid taken by the PA security forces. Some of the men detained in the ludicrous midnight raid had played a pivotal role in the front's decision to disarm. This is the PFLP had decided to disarm following Oslo. They had disagreed with Oslo, but they decided that they would not continue to have an arm of military action. So some of the men detained in the ludicrous midnight raid had played a pivotal role in the front's decision to disarm. Those same members had for years driven the movement's realistic trend. Muhammad Yiye Salman, one of the men detained, was in fact the Director General of the Transport Ministry. Indeed, when the Palestinian intelligence officers came to arrest Fatih al-Bawab, the oldest of the group, they had tears in their eyes. He had been released from an Israeli prison only a few months earlier and had been severely tortured by the Shabak during the Intifada. Fatah members who had been with him in prison shook their heads sadly and privately called his arrest a disgrace. Marwan Karfana was also arrested, although he had left the front and was now a senior staff member for Turje Larsen, the United Nations envoy in the occupied territories and a principal proponent of the Oslo Accords. Of course, after ritual lobbying at Arafat's office and the exercise of all kinds of wasta, W-A-S-T-A, is a term that refers to basically influence. So if you're going to use your wasta to get somebody out of jail, you're using your social capital, your influence. And the exercise of all after ritual lobbying at Arafat's office and the exercise of all kinds of wasta, the detainees were released within a day or two. None had been interrogated. The whole farce had patently been designed to satisfy Israel's demand for quick action. Without doubt, the Israeli security forces knew everything: who had been detained, what the men had done in the past, how they were being held, and just how idiotic the entire event really was. But the pressure to act was meant to elicit the authorities' obedient response, even when Israel's demand was illogical. And the Palestinian public got the message. There were no guarantees against arbitrary arrest, if that was Arafat's and Israel's desire. So you can see, if Oslo was supposed to be the hope, the change, the Palestinians were not seeing it on the ground. In fact, they were just seeing, instead of the Israelis and the Shabak arresting us in the middle of the night, now it's our own people, the Palestinians, doing it. And Fatah and the PA started to have this position in the minds of the Gazans, and big surprise, the Gazans decided they wanted to elect Hamas instead. This is an Amnesty International report on the secret court. The state security court trials in Gaza have been held secretly. All trials except one reportedly took place in the middle of the night. Many started around midnight. Some reportedly lasted only minutes. Those appointed to serve as judges in this court are active officers in the security forces who apparently have never before served as judges. The authorities gave no advance notice of these trials. People tried by the court have reportedly stated that they did not know they were to be tried until they were taken from their cell at night, or even until they set foot in the courtroom. Families of those tried, including those who visited their relatives days or even hours before the trial took place, were not even aware of any charges or trial until they heard on the radio that their relative had been convicted the night before. Some of those tried by the court were tried, sentenced, and convicted within 1 or 2 days of their arrest. Defendants have been represented by court-appointed lawyers. None have been defended by independent lawyers of their choice. At least some of the court-appointed lawyers are reportedly employees in the security forces. The lawyer of one defendant was not informed of the charges against his client and did not receive any notice of the trial. He was not aware that any trial had taken place until he heard on the radio that his client had been tried the previous night and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. State security court trials in Gaza are grossly unfair, violating minimum standards of international law, including the right to a fair and public trial by a competent, independent, and impartial tribunal, the right to have adequate time to prepare one's defense, the right to be defended by a lawyer of one's choice, the right to appeal to a higher court. Amnesty International has strongly condemned and opposed abuses by armed opposition groups in Gaza, including the deliberate killing of citizens in armed attacks and with suicide bombs. Authorities have the right and responsibility to bring to justice those responsible for crimes. But no government authority, under any circumstances, at any time, should assign security force officers to try citizens in secret proceedings, in the middle of the night, without a defense lawyer of their choice, without having time to prepare their defense. What about the people that are caught in the middle? You could say your everyday Gazans who are not in the security forces, who are not part of Hamas, who are not part of the Palestinian Authority. It was interesting to read what their responses were, because once again, the mainstream press would have us believe that everyone in Gaza is Hamas, everyone supports everything that Hamas does, nonviolent or violent. My next door neighbor has a fantasy of kidnapping an Israeli soldier, says Abu Jamil from Jabalia. What will you demand in exchange, we ask him. I'm smiling, okay, but you'll get why I'm smiling in a moment. I'm not smiling about kidnapping an Israeli soldier. What will you demand in exchange, we ask him. The release of all Palestinian prisoners? The prisoners can go to hell, he says. So what do you want, we ask. More leverage for Arafat in the negotiations? To hell with the negotiations, he says. I just want my work permit back. So, classic example of the frustration. All he wants is to be able to go work, even in Israel, so that he can earn money, so he can take care of his family. That is the limit of his ambitions. And when asked about these larger pan-Palestinian questions, would you like to get a prisoner exchange? Would you like to give Arafat more leverage in the negotiations? He doesn't care about the prisoners. He doesn't care about Arafat. He just wants to get a job. And that's neither right nor wrong, but I just want people to see that that person is not an exception. There are plenty of people in Gaza who think the same way, and they're entitled to think that way. Not everyone has to have solidarity with the Palestinian national movement. We would potentially, as outsiders, we would like them to think that in an ideal world, but that's not our place. It's not our fight in a certain sense. The Palestinians have to make the decisions for themselves. And if they want to kidnap an Israeli soldier so that they can get a work permit, they should be perfectly able to do that. My friend Mohammed, a subcontractor from Rafah, called me by cellular phone from a building site in Tel Aviv as soon as he heard the news. His two brothers had been killed in the Intifada, and he had never been a booster of the Oslo Accords. But that doesn't make these attacks okay, he said. All 40 of us working on this site are stuck. I feel like crying. I feel like screaming. I talked to guys from Hamas. I told them, okay, so don't agree that this is peace. Let's just say it's a ceasefire. Give people a chance to live for 2 or 3 years in peace and quiet. The police came at 10 in the morning and told us to stop working and get out. But where are we going to get a bus? The workers are afraid of being lynched by furious Israelis, so they went and hid in the cellar while I called for a bus. You hear these guys behind me? They're cursing Hamas and the jihad. Why did Hamas have to wait until we went back to work? Such big heroes. They couldn't have done it during the closure? I've always been against these things. Who rides the bus in the morning? Women, children, old people. You hear? Now they're saying goodbye to us, our employers, like they don't know when they'll see us again. The day after tomorrow, they've got 30 workers from Romania coming to replace us. So I think there had been some bus bombings by Hamas. These people had just gone out to a job site, and now they're trying to get back because there was going to be a border closure. In the summer of 1996, a few hundred refugees met in a hall at the Jabalia Sports Club. In public meetings like this all over the Strip, people have begun to voice their frustration and impatience at the unresolved contradictions in their lives. We don't want Mukhtars and VIPs here. We want ordinary people to come, one organizer said. And as the complaints burst forth, I heard the kinds of frank, insightful words that one cannot find in the Palestinian press, but that fill the streets. The truth is that we're just refugees on paper. Everyone knows we won't be going back to our villages. We're just pawns, that's all, and we're being treated like circus exhibits. They bring the donors to the camps so they'll be shocked, and then all the money goes to Ramal. Why don't they pave our streets? Why don't they plant a few trees? Why couldn't we have a little shade? Why are there electrical wires dangling all over the place where they can hurt the children? Why don't they build parks for our kids? Why can't we use the beach? It's the only place where we can get out, forget a little. They're putting up a hotel over here and an officers' club over there, and smack in the middle is somewhere for Arafat. The north and the south, that's all that's left. And you know what's there? The settlements. And obviously, this was at a time where there were still settlements in Gaza before the 2006 pullout. But what he's saying still matters. So, after hearing all of my readings from this, I hope you've gotten some insight into the manner, the mindset, the thought process of the Gazans, not just the Muwatanin, but the refugees who are living there. But these last few quotes, I think, will help sum up some of these thoughts that all of us have been having as we've been hearing this. I have never gotten used to the way most conversations end when we're talking about the Strip. With God's help, it'll all be okay. Thank God for this and every other situation. The sighs are long and the words are passive, heavy with the expectation of a miracle. Contrary to every stereotype, the people of Gaza are not hot-headed, but patient and slow to anger. Their powers of endurance border on apathy, and they easily put their faith in fantasies. We go on until we explode, I'd often heard, and no one can ever predict the moment of explosion. Of course, the passivity only makes the outbreak of the Intifada all the more remarkable. The popular uprising succeeded in defining a set of political goals precisely and realistically. Through the UNL's organization and preparation, its members were able to transform Palestinian rage into initiative and to translate the hope for heaven-sent salvation into deliberate, coordinated action. I'm proud of the refugees, Ahab al-Ashkar declared. We have a saying, I am the shepherd, and it is my hand that lifts me up. It means that I'm independent. Our poverty has made us strong, given our experience, so that nothing can budge us. Remember that we started the Intifada. Abu Ali also reminded me we revolted against the Israeli occupation immediately after 1967. I began to see how, consciously or otherwise, Gazans perceive the rifles, the khaki uniforms, and the bulge of pistols in the officers' belts as links in a chain that began with the loss of their villages, the expulsion, and the flight, and continued with hunger, poverty, and death. And again, I found that even people born and raised in the harrowing conditions of the camps, people who have never known anything else, are aware that they are being deprived. It enrages them. We can endure and even forget our past suffering if we feel that will lead to hope for our future, Jamal Zakut said when we talked about the Oslo Accords and the widespread Palestinian feeling that the agreement was unjust. Said al-Sayyam of Hamas could not say that he has accepted the idea of the state of Israel, but he has adjusted to reality. I don't hate the Israelis as Israelis or as Jews, but because they've treated us so badly, because of what the occupation has done to us. Siam felt that Israel first had to recognize that the Palestinians have been wronged. Whether the wrongdoing began in 1948 or in 1967 was not a pressing question for him. You people still don't acknowledge that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are occupied and that we have rights. The first condition for change is that you have to recognize the injustice done to us. We must look for a solution that will stand up to history, said Fayez Abu Shamala. A solution that will help us root out the hatred that has piled up in our hearts since the expulsion. And that last line, the hatred that has piled up in our hearts, remember that this is a two-way street of damage, that the Israelis may look like the aggressors, and they are, but they're also inflicting psychological damage on themselves. Gideon Levy talks about this, that the Israelis don't even realize how much they're traumatizing themselves in being so inhuman to other humans that it's killing them in their souls, and they're not even aware of it. So this is the last paragraph of the book, and I think was also a good way to sum up this review. In their hearts, Palestinians will persist in seeing all the land as theirs. They will not renounce their longing for the fields that now bear Hebrew names. They will not forget the pain of expulsion, the very first link in a chain of loss that goes on. But from living in Gaza, I learned that its people have the ability and an honest desire to separate their heartfelt wishes from the need for a peaceful political solution. We are, after all, the mother of the child, they say, alluding to King Solomon's judgment, to explain their readiness to share the country. On condition, of course, that any solution treat the Palestinians with dignity, as a people with elemental rights, and a claim equal to that of the others who live in this land and call it home. So, Turkey at Gaza by Amira Haas. Can't recommend it enough. It's one more opportunity to learn about the Palestinians on a human level, not necessarily on a political or military level, although you will learn a little bit about that as well, and some insights into Oslo as it was happening, results of the first Intifada right after it had happened. So it's a time capsule published in 1996 and gives us a wonderful snapshot of what Palestinian society, particularly Gazan society, was thinking at that time. So if you'd like to support this channel, please hit like, subscribe, share this with people who'd be open-minded and who'd like to hear about what the Palestinians are like as humans, as people deserving of dignity and respect. You can also buy a copy of this book. That's another way you can support this channel. If you'd really like to support the channel, you'd like to get into discussions with me privately, or you'd like to get to early reviews of these, early releases of these reviews, you can become a member of the YouTube members, or you can become a member of my Patreon. The link is there below. And a reminder that in 2024, all of the different ways of revenue that the channel receives, a portion of that is going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, who provides medical care to children in Gaza who could not otherwise get medical care. If you haven't seen part 1 of this review, there'll be a link to it in the description. Go back and read that. You'll learn a little bit more about the realities of the occupation, and I think it'll be a good complement to this part as well. Finally, if you'd like to interact with me more, you can find me here on YouTube. There's quotes and maps and other things that I post on a daily basis, and you can comment. We can go back and forth there. I'm also there on X, and there'll be a link in the description to chat with me there if you'd like. And there's also a link to the Amazon wish list if you'd like to buy a book for 2025 that you'd like me to review. We're still going to be focused almost exclusively on Israel and Palestine for the rest of this year for good reason. But you can potentially put a book in line for next year. Until next time, enjoy your reading.